Twilight cast long shadows across the smoldering ruins of the Al Rasha Palace. The day of consecration, meant to be a celebration of prosperity and renewal, had ended in flames and destruction. Smoke still rose from the collapsed domes and shattered spires, twisting into the darkening sky like vengeful spirits. Syrian moved through the devastation with practiced caution, his weathered armor scuffed and dulled from years of wandering. The night had been passing through the outskirts of the city when he'd seen the inferno erupt, and some long-dormant sense of duty had pulled him toward the chaos rather than away from it. Now, as he navigated the labyrinth of fallen columns and crumbling walls, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The heat was still oppressive, forcing him to breathe through a dampened cloth. His eyes stung from the smoke, but years of battle had taught him to endure discomfort. What he couldn't ignore was the eerie silence. Where were the royal guards, the palace servants, the survivors and rescuers? A sound caught his attention, a soft moan, barely audible above the settling of debris. Syrian changed direction, moving toward what had once been the grand reception hall. The ornate ceiling had collapsed, and the mosaic floor was now buried beneath marble and wood. But there, beneath a partially fallen archway, he saw a flash of gold. He rushed forward, caution momentarily forgotten. As he drew closer, he realized what he was seeing: a woman, her elaborate dress torn and blackened, with a scorched crown still perched precariously on her head. Royal insignias, though damaged by fire, were clearly visible on her garments. "Your Majesty?" Syrian called, dropping to one knee beside her. No response. He gently pressed 2 fingers to her neck and found a pulse, weak but steady. The structure above them groaned ominously. There was no time for gentle rescue. Syrian gathered the unconscious woman in his arms and retreated from the unstable archway, just as it collapsed behind them in a thunderous roar of stone and dust. The knight moved swiftly through the ruins, cradling the royal figure against his chest. She was surprisingly light, as though the fire had consumed not just her finery, but something of her substance as well. Her face, though smudged with soot, bore the unmistakable refinement of nobility: high cheekbones, an elegant jaw, and skin that, where unmarred by smoke, was pale as porcelain. By the time Syrian reached the edge of the palace grounds, night had fallen completely. The ash forest beyond the palace walls loomed dark and forbidding, the trees mere shadows against the star-filled sky. He laid the woman gently on a patch of grass, untouched by fire, and used water from his flask to clean her face. "Your Majesty," he said again, more urgently this time. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly. Her eyes were a startling violet, a color Syrian had seen only among the highest of nobility. "Where?" she began, then coughed violently. Syrian supported her head as she struggled to breathe. "The palace has fallen," he explained, keeping his voice calm and steady. "There was a fire. I found you in the ruins." Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed quickly by confusion, then fear. She tried to sit up, wincing with the effort. "Easy," Syrian cautioned. "You may have injuries we can't see." "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Syrian, a traveler, nothing more." She studied his face intently, as though searching for something. Whatever she saw, or didn't see, caused her expression to shift from confusion to dawning horror. "You think I'm the queen," she said, the words not a question but a realization. Syrian frowned. "Are you not?" She touched the crown still perched on her head, then removed it with trembling fingers. In the moonlight, what had appeared to be jewels embedded in the gold were revealed as colored glass, now partially melted from the heat. "They used me as bait," she whispered, looking up at Syrian with eyes now wide with fear. "To lure you." The knight's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword. "Who did? Lure me for what purpose?" But the woman's strength was failing. Her eyes rolled back, and she slumped once more into unconsciousness, the false crown slipping from her fingers to land softly on the ash-covered ground. Syrian remained motionless for several heartbeats, his mind racing. If this was a trap, where were the trappers? And why target a wandering knight of no particular importance? Unless they thought he was someone else. He scanned the darkness around them but saw no movement, heard nothing but the distant crackle of embers. Nevertheless, they couldn't stay here. Whoever had set this elaborate trap would surely be looking for them both. With a decision made, Syrian carefully lifted the woman once more. Stonehaven, the neighboring city-state, was less than a day's journey. There, perhaps, he could find answers and ensure the mysterious woman received the care she needed. As he trudged through the ash forest, the trees around him stood like specters, their branches stripped bare by some long-ago catastrophe. Legend had it that a magical conflagration had swept through this land centuries ago, leaving the forest forever changed, trees that would never burn again, but also never truly live. It seemed a fitting path for their escape from the burning palace. The woman stirred occasionally in his arms, mumbling words he couldn't quite catch. Each time, Syrian would pause, hoping she might wake and provide some explanation for her cryptic warning. But true consciousness eluded her. By dawn, they had reached the edge of the ash forest. Before them stretched rolling hills leading toward Stonehaven, its stone walls visible in the distance, catching the first light of morning. Syrian found a small stream and gently laid the woman on its bank. He bathed her face again, noting with concern that her skin felt hot to the touch. This time, when her eyes opened, they were clearer, more focused. "We need to keep moving," she said immediately, attempting to sit up. "First, you need to explain," Syrian countered, gently but firmly pressing her back down. "Who are you? Who set this trap? And why do they want me?" She swallowed hard, her gaze darting past him to the horizon, as though expecting pursuit. "My name is Leora," she said finally. "I was a handmaiden in the palace. 3 days ago, several of us were taken to a chamber deep beneath the royal quarters. They dressed me as the queen, placed that mockery of a crown on my head." Her voice trembled. "I heard them planning. They spoke of a knight who would come when he saw the palace in flames, a knight they needed to capture or kill." "But why me?" Syrian pressed. "I'm nobody of importance." Leora's eyes met his, filled with uncertainty. "I don't know. They never said your name, only that you would come, that you always come when there is suffering." She hesitated. There was something about a prophecy. Syrian frowned. He had been many things in his life, soldier, mercenary, wanderer, but never the subject of prophecy. Unless... Did they mention the name of this knight they sought? "The Knight of Ashes," Leora whispered. "They called him, you, the Knight of Ashes." A chill ran down Syrian's spine despite the morning warmth. It was a name he hadn't heard in many years, a title he'd abandoned, along with his formal commission. Few living souls knew of that identity. "We need to reach Stonehaven," he said, pushing aside his unease. "Can you walk?" Leora nodded, though uncertainty flashed across her face. With Syrian's help, she rose to her feet, swaying slightly before finding her balance. "Why Stonehaven?" she asked as they began their slow journey across the hills. "I have contacts there," Syrian replied. "People who might help us understand what's happening, and it's far enough from Al Rasha that we should be safe for a time." They walked in silence for a while, Leora leaning on Syrian's arm when the terrain grew difficult. Despite her ordeal, she moved with a natural grace that made the knight wonder if she had been merely a handmaiden. As she claimed. "The real queen," Syrian said suddenly. "What happened to her?" Leora's pace faltered. "I don't know. The palace had been in chaos for days before the fire. Rumors of plots, betrayals. The royal family hadn't been seen publicly since the beginning of the consecration ceremonies.
And the king?
The same. There were whispers that he had been taken ill, but nothing certain. By midday, they had covered half the distance to Stonehaven. They rested in the shadow of a solitary oak, sharing Syrian's meager rations. The knight studied the woman as she ate, noting details he had missed in the darkness. Her hands, though dirty from their escape, showed none of the calluses one would expect from a life of service. And though her speech was carefully modulated, occasionally a phrase or inflection betrayed education beyond that typically afforded to palace servants. "You're not a handmaiden," he said finally. Leora froze, a piece of dried fruit halfway to her mouth. After a moment, she lowered her hand and met his gaze steadily. "What makes you say that?" "Experience," Syrian replied simply. "I've known nobility and I've known servants. You carry yourself like the former." A complicated series of emotions crossed her face: fear, resignation, and finally, a sort of grim determination.
"I've told you no lies," she said carefully. "I was indeed serving in the palace. But you're right. It was not my lifelong role."
Before she could elaborate, a sound caught Syrian's attention, the distant thunder of hooves. He rose swiftly, drawing Leora up beside him. "Someone's coming," he said, scanning the horizon. In the distance, a cloud of dust marked the approach of riders from the direction of Al-Rasha.
"How did they find us so quickly?"
Leora gasped. Syrian didn't answer, already pulling her toward a stand of trees that offered their only hope of concealment. They had barely reached cover when the riders came into view. 6 men, in the distinctive armor of the palace guard, their cloaks bearing the emblem of the royal house of Al-Rasha.
"The Queen's personal guard," Leora whispered, eyes wide. "But why would they—"
"Quiet," Syrian cautioned, watching as the riders slowed, clearly following their trail. The knight silently cursed himself for his carelessness. In his concern for Leora's condition, he had made little effort to hide their tracks. The leader of the riders, a tall figure with a commander's plume on his helmet, raised his hand, bringing the group to a halt, not 50 paces from their hiding place. "Spread out," he ordered, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "They can't have gone far." As the guards began to dismount, Syrian made a swift calculation. The trees provided inadequate cover. They would be discovered within minutes. Fighting 6 trained royal guards was a fool's errand, even for a knight of his experience. "We need a distraction," he murmured to Leora. To his surprise, she nodded decisively. "I can provide one. When I move, head west, toward that ravine." She pointed to a depression in the landscape that Syrian had noted earlier. "I'll meet you there." Before he could object, Leora had slipped away, moving with surprising stealth through the underbrush. Syrian tensed, ready to intervene if she was spotted, but she vanished from his sight without raising an alarm. For several long moments, nothing happened. The guards methodically began searching the area, moving ever closer to Syrian's position. Then, suddenly, a woman's scream rang out from the opposite direction, followed by the sound of someone crashing through vegetation. "There!" shouted one of the guards, and as one, they rushed toward the commotion. Syrian didn't waste the opportunity. He sprinted toward the ravine, keeping low and using the rolling terrain for cover. Upon reaching the depression, he found it deeper than expected, with a small stream running along its bottom and dense shrubbery lining its sides. He pressed himself against the earth, controlling his breathing as he listened for pursuit. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sounds of the guards' search grew distant, then faded entirely. Still, Syrian waited, concern for Leora warring with the tactical necessity of remaining hidden. Just as he was preparing to risk exposure to look for her, a rustle in the shrubbery above announced her arrival. She slid down the ravine wall with controlled precision, coming to rest beside him with barely a sound.
How did you manage that?
Syrian asked, genuinely impressed. A ghost of a smile touched her lips.
I spent my childhood in the palace gardens, learning every hiding place and secret path. These men are trained to fight, not to track. I led them on a chase, then doubled back.
Once again, Syrian found himself questioning her claimed identity. Such skills were not typically part of a handmaiden's education.
We should move, Leora continued. All business now.
They'll realize the deception soon enough.
They followed the ravine for several miles, using its depth to conceal their movement. By the time they emerged, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, and Stonehaven's walls loomed much closer.
Who are we seeking in Stonehaven? Leora asked as they approached the city.
An old acquaintance, Syrian replied.
A scholar who may be able to tell us more about this Night of Ashes prophecy, and why someone would go to such lengths to target me with it. As they drew nearer to the city gates, Syrian noticed Leora growing increasingly tense.
What troubles you?
She hesitated. Stonehaven and Al Rasha have close diplomatic ties. If word of the palace fire has reached here, the gates will be watched.
We won't use the main entrance, Syrian assured her.
There are other ways into the city for those who know where to look.
True to his word, the knight led them not to the imposing main gates, but to a seemingly unremarkable section of wall, near a small watercourse that flowed out from the city. There, partially hidden by willows, was a low archway barred by a rusty grate.
Syrian produced a small key from a hidden pocket in his armor. A remnant from more troubled times, he explained, as he unlocked the grate. Few remember these emergency exits now that peace has reigned for so many years. They slipped through the narrow passage, emerging in a quiet corner of Stonehaven's lower district. The contrast with the devastation of Al Rasha was stark. Here, life continued undisturbed, with merchants closing their shops for the evening and citizens returning to their homes. No one paid particular attention to the travel-worn pair making their way through the back streets. Syrian led them to a modest building nestled between a bookbinder's shop and an apothecary. A weathered sign bearing the image of an open book and a quill hung above the door.
Asmar's domain, Syrian said. Part library, part laboratory, well, you'll see. He knocked in a particular pattern, 3 quick raps, followed by 2 slower ones. After a moment, the door swung open to reveal a thin man with a wild mane of silver hair and eyes magnified to an unsettling degree by thick spectacles.
"Syrian?"
the man exclaimed, his voice rising in pitch with surprise.
"By all the forgotten gods! It's been years! What brings—"
He stopped abruptly, noticing Leora. His expression shifted from delight to wariness.
"And who is this?"
"A friend in need of sanctuary," Syrian replied. "May we enter? Our business is best discussed away from curious ears." Asmar hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. Of course. Though I warn you, the place is in a bit of disarray. Research. You understand?" Disarray proved to be a generous description. The interior of Asmar's home was a labyrinth of books, scrolls, and peculiar artifacts stacked on every available surface. Glass vessels containing substances of improbable colors bubbled and smoked on cluttered tables. Star charts and mysterious diagrams covered the walls, some annotated so heavily that the original images were barely visible. Leora gazed around in undisguised wonder as Asmar led them to a relatively clear space near a fireplace, where 3 chairs sat amidst the chaos, like islands in a paper sea.
Sit, the scholar urged, clearing additional books from the seats. "I'll prepare some tea. You both look as though you've journeyed through the 9 hells."
As he bustled away to an adjoining room, Syrian leaned closer to Leora. "Asmar is eccentric but trustworthy. If anyone can help us understand what's happening, it's him." She nodded, though her eyes continued to dart around the room, taking in the strange collection with obvious fascination.
Asmar returned quickly with a tray bearing 3 steaming cups. "Now," he said, settling into the third chair, "tell me what brings a wandering knight and his mysterious companion to my humble abode after all these years." Syrian recounted the events at Al-Rasha, the palace fire, finding Leora, and her cryptic warning about being used as bait. He described their pursuit by the royal guards and their narrow escape. "Most troubling of all," he concluded, "is this business about a prophecy and something called the Night of Ashes." At this, Asmar nearly choked on his tea. "The Night of Ashes? They use those exact words?" Leora nodded. "Yes. They seemed certain this night would come when they set the palace ablaze." The scholar removed his spectacles and began polishing them nervously with the edge of his robe. "This is worse than I feared. Much worse." "You know of this prophecy?" Syrian pressed. "Not a prophecy, precisely," Asmar replied, replacing his spectacles. "More of a legend, one that dates back to the founding of Al-Rasha itself." He rose and began searching through the nearest stack of books, muttering to himself. "Ah, here it is!" He extracted a volume bound in faded red leather, its pages yellow with age. Returning to his seat, he carefully opened the book to a marked page. "And it shall come to pass," he read, "that when the royal line falters and flame engulfs the sacred halls, the Night of Ashes shall emerge from the forgotten places to judge the worthy and unworthy alike. In his hands rest both destruction and salvation, for he alone can discern the true heir from the false." Asmar looked up from the text, his expression grave. "It goes on. But that's the essence of it. The legend speaks of a time of crisis for the kingdom, when the succession is in dispute. The Knight of Ashes is supposedly some sort of arbiter, a figure who appears to set things right." "But that's absurd," Syrian protested. "I'm no arbiter or judge. I'm just a wandering knight who happened to be passing by." "Were you, though?" Asmar asked, peering at him intently. "Just passing by, I mean?" Syrian shifted uncomfortably. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that perhaps your presence near Al-Rasha on the day of consecration was not entirely coincidental. The legend is specific about the night emerging from forgotten places. You, my friend, have spent years making yourself forgotten." A tense silence fell over the room. Leora looked between the two men, confusion evident on her face. "I don't understand," she said finally. "If Syrian is this Knight of Ashes from the legend, why would someone try to capture or kill him? Wouldn't they want his judgment if the succession is truly in dispute?" "That," Asmar said grimly, "depends entirely on whether they believe they would be judged worthy or unworthy." Syrian stood abruptly, pacing the small, clear area of floor. "This is madness. I abandoned that title and all it represented, years ago. I'm no one's savior or judge. Yet, here you are," Asmar observed quietly, "with a woman rescued from the burning palace, a woman dressed as royalty, but claiming to be a servant. If that's not the beginning of a legend come to life, I don't know what is." Leora rose as well, facing Syrian directly. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice steady despite the fear visible in her eyes. "Something I haven't told you." Both men turned to her expectantly. "I said I was a handmaiden in the palace, and that was true. But what I didn't tell you," she took a deep breath, "I was handmaiden to Princess Leora, second daughter to King Thalion." Syrian stared at her in confusion. "But you said your name was—" "Leora," she finished for him. "Yes, because I am the princess. The handmaiden was my cover, my protection. For years, my existence was kept secret from all but a few trusted members of the court." Asmar sank back into his chair, mouth agape. "The second daughter. But the succession laws of Al-Rasha are clear. Only the firstborn can inherit." "The laws were changed," Leora replied, quietly, after my sister Alara's marriage to Prince Doran of the Eastern Territories. The king, my father, feared that Alara's husband would have too much influence over Al-Rasha if she took the throne. So he decreed that should anything happen to him, I would become queen instead. And has something happened to him? Syrian asked quietly.
Tears welled in Leora's eyes. I believe so. 3 days before the fire, my father's closest advisor came to me in secret. He said the king had been poisoned and that my sister's husband was behind it. He told me I needed to prepare to claim the throne, but then he disappeared. The next day, I was seized and forced to play the part of a decoy queen. So whoever set the palace ablaze, Asmar mused, wanted to eliminate both you and this Knight of Ashes in one stroke. They fear his ability to discern the true heir from the false. This is why the royal guards were pursuing us, Syrian realized. They weren't trying to rescue you. They were trying to finish what the fire failed to do.
Leora nodded grimly.
I believe my sister's husband, Prince Doran, is behind this. He has always been ambitious, and with both my father and me out of the way, Alara would inherit, and through her, he would rule Al-Rasha.
We need proof, Syrian said firmly. Accusations against a royal consort are dangerous, even for a princess.
There may be evidence in the palace archives, Leora suggested.
My father kept detailed records of all court matters. If Doran was plotting against him, there might be some documentation, letters, meeting minutes, something that could expose him.
The archives survived the fire, Asmar asked, surprised.
They're housed in a separate building, constructed of stone and protected by powerful wards, Leora explained.
Even if the main palace burned to the ground, the archives would remain intact.
Syrian exchanged a look with Asmar. So we return to Al-Rasha, he said, the words more statement than question.
Not we, Leora corrected. Me. I know the archives, the guards' rotations, the secret passages. I can move through the palace grounds undetected.
Absolutely not, Syrian countered immediately.
It's too dangerous. If you're caught. If I'm caught, I'll claim my rightful identity,
Leora interrupted. Many of the palace staff would recognize me, even those who don't know I'm the princess. And if Prince Doran truly is behind this plot, he won't risk harming me openly. He needs to maintain the appearance of legitimacy.
She has a point, Asmar admitted reluctantly.
And she would attract far less attention than a wandering knight, especially one who may already be the subject of a manhunt. Syrian frowned, clearly unhappy with the direction of the conversation. At least allow me to accompany you to the city walls. I can wait outside while you search the archives.
Leora considered this, then nodded.
Very well, but we'll need disguises for the journey. The roads will be watched.
That I can help with, Asmar said, rising once more.
In my years of research, I've found that a scholar is often welcome where others are not. I have credentials that will get you past most checkpoints. Traveling researcher and assistant, perhaps. As Asmar rummaged through a trunk in the corner, producing scholarly robes and documents, Syrian moved closer to Leora. Are you certain about this? He asked quietly. If what you say is true, you're risking everything. Her violet eyes met his, resolution clear in their depths. My father taught me that a ruler's first duty is to their people. If Doran takes the throne through treachery, Al-Rasha will suffer. I can't allow that, even if it means risking my life. Syrian studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once. Then we do this together, knight and princess, facing the fire. A hint of a smile touched Leora's lips.
Knight of Ashes, she corrected softly. Whether you accept the title or not, it seems the legend has chosen you.
Before Syrian could respond, Asmar returned with their disguises and forged travel papers. These should get you back to Al-Rasha without incident. I've marked you as researchers documenting the day of consecration ceremonies for the university archives. As they changed into the scholarly attire, Asmar continued, "There's something else you should know about this Night of Ashes legend." He hesitated, glancing at Syrian. "The text mentions a test, a way to confirm the knight's identity." "What kind of test?" Syrian asked warily. "It says, 'By ash and flame shall he be known, for fire will turn from him as water from stone.'" Asmar adjusted his spectacles nervously. "The legend claims the Knight of Ashes cannot be harmed by fire." Syrian's expression darkened. "That part of the legend, at least, is false. I have the scars to prove it." "Perhaps it's metaphorical," Leora suggested. "Many ancient texts use symbolic language." "Perhaps," Asmar agreed, though he sounded unconvinced. "In any case, you should depart at first light. The roads are too dangerous to travel after dark, especially with increased patrols from Al-Rasha." That night, Syrian slept fitfully on a pallet in Asmar's crowded study. His dreams were haunted by flames and falling stones, by a crown that melted like wax, and a woman's voice calling him by a title he had long abandoned. He woke before dawn, a sense of urgency driving him from his makeshift bed. To his surprise, he found Leora already awake, sitting by a window that overlooked Stonehaven's sleeping streets. In the pale pre-dawn light, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her borrowed scholar's robe drawn close against the chill, she looked nothing like either a princess or a handmaiden. Just a young woman bearing a burden too heavy for her years. "You should be resting," Syrian said softly, joining her by the window. She glanced at him, a tired smile briefly lighting her features. "So should you. But I suspect neither of us is particularly good at doing what we should." That drew a chuckle from him. "A fair assessment." They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching as the first hints of color began to touch the eastern sky. "May I ask you something?" Leora said eventually. "Of course." "This title, Knight of Ashes." Asmar spoke as though it was something you once claimed but gave up. "What did he mean?" Syrian sighed, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Many years ago, I served in the king's elite guard, not in Al-Rasha, but in Varenth, far to the north. There was a terrible fire in the royal castle, started by assassins targeting the queen. I was the only guard who made it through the flames to her chambers." His voice grew distant with memory. "They found us afterward, both alive, though badly burned. The queen recovered. I carried the scars, and the name they gave me, Knight of Ashes." "What happened then?" Leora prompted gently, when he fell silent. "Politics happened," Syrian replied, a bitter edge to his words. "The assassination attempt was part of a larger plot. The queen's survival was inconvenient for certain powerful factions. My testimony about what I saw that night made me dangerous. There was another attempt, not on the queen this time, but on me." "They tried to kill you?" "They tried to discredit me first. When that failed, yes. They tried more direct methods." His hand unconsciously moved to his side, where Leora guessed another scar lay hidden. "I realized then that I couldn't protect the queen by staying. My presence only made her a target. So I disappeared, became just another wandering knight, seeking work where he could find it." "And yet here you are," Leora observed, once again pulling royalty from the flames. A humorless smile crossed Syrian's face. "So it seems. Perhaps some patterns are too deeply ingrained to break." Their conversation was interrupted by Asmar, who entered bearing a tray with bread, cheese, and tea. "Eat quickly," he advised. "You should be on the road before the city fully wakes." They broke their fast in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they had finished, Asmar presented them with traveling packs containing provisions, water, and a few items he insisted might prove useful. Vials of mysterious liquids, small cloth bags of powder, and a pair of amulets on leather cords. "For protection," he explained, hanging one around each of their necks. "Nothing too powerful. I'm a scholar, not a mage, but they may help conceal your true natures from casual observation. By the time they departed through Stonehaven's main gate, the sun had just cleared the horizon. Their scholarly disguises passed without comment from the sleepy guards, and soon they were on the road to Al Rasha, two apparent academics discussing ancient texts as they walked. The journey was uneventful until midday, when they crested a hill and saw a checkpoint ahead, a temporary structure manned by soldiers bearing the insignia of both Al Rasha and the Eastern Territories. "Doran's men," Leora murmured, instinctively moving closer to Syrian. "Mixed with the royal guard." "Remember, we're simply scholars," Syrian reminded her, though his posture had subtly shifted to readiness. "Let me do the talking." As they approached the checkpoint, a guard stepped forward, hand raised. "Halt! State your business on this road." Syrian adopted the slightly distracted air of an academic, fumbling with the papers Asmar had provided. "Oh, yes, of course. Magister Thorn and apprentice, from the University of Stonehaven. We're documenting the consecration ceremonies for the historical archives." He handed over the forged credentials. The guard examined the papers with obvious suspicion. "You're traveling toward Al Rasha? The ceremonies ended days ago." "Indeed, indeed," Syrian agreed readily. "Most unfortunate timing on our part. Bureaucracy at the university delayed our departure. But we hope to interview participants, gather first-hand accounts before memories fade. You understand?" The guard looked unconvinced. "There was a fire at the palace. The city is closed to visitors." "A fire?" Syrian exclaimed, with carefully calibrated surprise. "We had heard nothing of this in Stonehaven. Was anyone injured? The royal family?" "That information is not for public knowledge," the guard cut him off. He turned to another soldier. "Search their packs." Syrian and Leora submitted to the search with the appropriate mixture of academic indignation and compliance. The second guard methodically went through their belongings, paying particular attention to the vials and pouches Asmar had provided. "What are these?" he demanded, holding up one of the cloth bags. "Preservation compounds for documents," Leora answered smoothly, before Syrian could speak. "Ancient parchment is quite sensitive to moisture and light. We use these to ensure that any materials we examine remain undamaged." The guard grunted, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. He was about to close the pack when a commotion arose at the far end of the checkpoint. A rider had arrived and was speaking urgently to the officer in charge. Syrian tensed, readying himself for trouble, but the distraction worked in their favor. The guard hastily returned their packs and waved them through, his attention drawn to the newcomer. They proceeded at a deliberately measured pace until they were safely out of sight around a bend in the road. Only then did Leora release a shaky breath. "That was too close," she whispered. "Did you see the rider? He wore the insignia of Prince Doran's personal guard." Syrian nodded grimly. "They're looking for us specifically now. We need to leave the road." They veered off into the countryside, taking a less direct but more concealed route toward Al Rasha. The going was slower, but they encountered no more checkpoints. By late afternoon, the distant silhouette of the city came into view, the damaged palace clearly visible even from afar. "We should wait until nightfall before approaching the archives," Leora advised as they found a sheltered spot to rest. "The changing of the guard occurs at midnight. There's a brief window when the western entrance is less closely watched." Syrian nodded, impressed once again by her knowledge of palace security. "How will we get inside the city walls? I doubt the main gates will be as easy to pass as that checkpoint." "There's another way," Leora replied. "The aqueduct enters the city near the western wall. Part of it runs underground, but there are maintenance tunnels alongside it. Few know of them. They were designed as an escape route for the royal family in times of siege." As darkness fell, they moved closer to the city, keeping to the shadows. The devastation of the palace fire was even more apparent now,
An entire wing had collapsed, and scaffolding had been erected around what remained of the main structure. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their torches creating pools of light against the blackness. They circled wide around the city, approaching from the west where the aqueduct cut through the outer wall. Just as Leora had described, there was a narrow tunnel running parallel to the water channel, hidden behind a stand of dense shrubbery. "How did you learn of this passage?" Syrian asked, as they squeezed through the entrance. "My father showed me," Leora replied, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "He said a ruler should always know every entrance and exit to their domain. Knowledge is survival," he would say. The tunnel was low and narrow, forcing them to proceed in a hunched position. Water seeped through the stone walls, making the footing treacherous. After what felt like an eternity of cramped progress, they emerged into a slightly larger chamber with several branching passages. "This way," Leora whispered, selecting the leftmost tunnel without hesitation. "This leads to the gardens behind the archive building." True to her word, the passage eventually opened into a small alcove concealed by ornamental shrubs. Beyond lay the formal gardens of the palace grounds, and beyond those, a squat stone building with a distinctive domed roof, the archives. They paused in the shelter of the alcove, observing the guards' patrol patterns. As Leora had predicted, the western side of the archives was less heavily guarded, with only a single sentry making rounds at irregular intervals. "Wait for my signal," Leora murmured. She produced a small pouch from within her robes, one of Asmar's mysterious gifts. "When the guard passes next, I'll create a distraction. We'll have perhaps 2 minutes to reach that side entrance." Syrian nodded, preparing himself for quick movement. They didn't have to wait long. The guard soon appeared, torch in hand, making his way along the perimeter of the building with the bored gait of a man who expected no trouble. As soon as he passed their position, Leora threw the pouch toward the opposite side of the gardens. It burst on impact with a soft popping sound, releasing a cloud of glittering dust that swirled and rose into the air. Immediately, small flames began to dance among the particles, creating the illusion of multiple torchbearers moving among the trees. The guard reacted predictably, calling out a challenge and then hurrying toward the mysterious lights. The moment he was out of sight, Syrian and Leora dashed across the open space to the archive's side entrance. The door was locked, but Leora produced a key from within her robes. "Another gift from my father," she explained as she worked the mechanism. The lock yielded with a satisfying click, and they slipped inside just as the guards' shouts brought reinforcements running from other parts of the grounds. The interior of the archives was cool and dark, smelling of parchment and binding glue. Leora moved confidently through the stacks, navigating by memory toward a specific section at the rear of the building. "The royal correspondence is kept here," she whispered, indicating a series of locked cabinets along the back wall. Recent communications would be in this one. She approached a particular cabinet and hesitated. "This will be more difficult. I don't have a key for these." Syrian stepped forward, examining the lock. It was more sophisticated than the door mechanism, but not beyond his capabilities. From a hidden pocket in his scholar's robe, he produced a set of slender tools. "Another remnant of your days in the royal guard?" Leora asked with a raised eyebrow. "A knight who relies solely on his sword is a knight who doesn't survive long," Syrian replied, setting to work on the lock. It took several tense minutes, but eventually the mechanism surrendered with a faint click. Inside the cabinet were dozens of neatly organized scrolls and folded documents, each bearing the seal of various noble houses and foreign dignitaries. Leora scanned the labels quickly, extracting several that bore the mark of the Eastern Territories. "Here," she said, unfolding a document with obvious excitement. "This is correspondence between my father and Prince Doran from just before the consecration ceremonies." Her eyes darted across the page, widening with each line. "By the gods, it's all here. Doran was demanding my father reverse his decision about the succession. He's explicit about his ambitions for Al-Rasha. Syrian leaned closer, reading over her shoulder. The letter was indeed damning. Prince Doran had made thinly veiled threats about consequences should the king maintain his position regarding Princess Leora's right to succession. "This isn't enough to prove he poisoned your father or orchestrated the fire," Syrian cautioned. "No, but it establishes motive," Leora replied, carefully refolding the letter and tucking it into her robe. "We need to find records from the king's private council meetings. Those would be in—" A noise from the front of the building silenced her. Footsteps, multiple sets, were approaching the archives. "Hide," Syrian whispered urgently, closing the cabinet as quietly as possible. They slipped behind a large bookcase just as the main door opened, admitting several figures carrying lanterns. "Search everywhere," commanded a cultured voice that dripped with authority. "The princess must have come for evidence. If she reaches the council records, all our plans are forfeit." Leora's hand found Syrian's in the darkness, squeezing tightly. The voice belonged to Prince Doran himself. "And if we find her?" "Your Highness," asked another voice, one of the guards, presumably. "Detain her, of course," Doran replied smoothly. "She is unwell, overcome with grief at her father's illness. She must be returned to the palace for her own safety." The search party spread out, methodically examining each row of shelves. Syrian and Leora pressed deeper into the shadows, but it was clear they would be discovered soon. There was nowhere to run. Leora leaned close to Syrian's ear. "The skylight," she breathed, barely audible. She pointed upward, where a small glass dome allowed moonlight into the archives. Syrian assessed the situation quickly. The bookcase they were hiding behind reached nearly to the ceiling. If they could climb it without being heard, they might reach the skylight. But then what? The drop back to the ground outside would be considerable. Before he could formulate a plan, a shout went up from one of the searchers. "The cabinet's been tampered with! They've been here!" "Find them!" Doran's voice cracked like a whip. "They must still be in the building!" There was no more time for stealth. Syrian grasped the shelving and began to climb, motioning for Leora to follow. The wooden structure creaked ominously under their weight, immediately drawing attention. "There, behind the east bookcase!" Lantern light flooded their hiding place as guards rushed toward them. Syrian reached the top of the bookcase and hurriedly examined the skylight. It was hinged on one side, designed to be opened for ventilation. He pushed against it, and to his relief, it swung upward. "Hurry!" he urged, helping Leora up the final shelf. She scrambled through the opening, and he followed just as hands grabbed at his ankles. He kicked free and pulled himself onto the domed roof of the archives. "Now what?" Leora gasped, clutching at the smooth curve of the dome to keep from sliding off. Below them, they could hear Doran shouting orders to surround the building. Guards were already emerging from the main entrance, spreading out to cover all possible escape routes. Syrian scanned their surroundings frantically. The archives stood somewhat apart from the main palace complex, but not so far that they couldn't potentially reach another building. Directly to their east, perhaps 20 feet away, stood a structure that had partially collapsed in the fire. What had once been the palace's eastern wing. "There," he decided, pointing to the ruined building. "We can jump to that exposed beam, then make our way down through the interior." Leora looked at the gap between buildings, then back at Syrian with obvious doubt. "That's a long jump." "I'll go first," he said, positioning himself on the edge of the dome. "If I make it, you follow. If not—" He didn't finish the thought. Drawing a deep breath, Syrian launched himself across the gap. For one heart-stopping moment, he hung suspended in air, certain he had misjudged the distance. Then his hands closed around the charred wooden beam, his momentum swinging him beneath it. He hung there for a moment, gathering his strength, then pulled himself up to straddle the beam. "Come on!" he called to Leora,
who stood poised on the edge of the dome, her scholarly robes billowing in the night breeze. She hesitated, only briefly, then jumped. Her leap was more graceful than Syrian's, but shorter. She caught the beam with her hands, but couldn't pull herself up. For a terrible moment, she dangled there, feet kicking at empty air. Syrian lunged forward, grasping her wrists. "I've got you!" he grunted, hauling her up beside him. No sooner were they both safely on the beam than shouts erupted from below. They had been spotted. An arrow whistled past, embedding itself in the wood inches from Syrian's hand. "This way," he urged, guiding Leora along the beam toward what remained of the building's interior. The fire had gutted this section of the palace, leaving a skeletal framework of stone and charred wood. They picked their way carefully through the ruins, descending level by level toward the ground floor. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of pursuit, guards attempting to follow their perilous path through the unstable structure. Twice more arrows flew past them, but the darkness and the complex architecture of the ruins made accurate shooting impossible. They reached the ground floor and found themselves in what had once been a grand hall, now open to the sky where the roof had collapsed. Moonlight illuminated a scene of devastation, melted candelabras, shattered marble, and the ghostly remains of tapestries clinging to blackened walls. "The passage we used to enter the city," Leora said breathlessly. "If we can reach it." "You'll reach nothing but a cell, dear sister," came a new voice from the shadows. A woman stepped into a patch of moonlight, her resemblance to Leora unmistakable, despite her more mature features and regal bearing. Or perhaps the grave, depending on how cooperative you prove to be. "Alara," Leora whispered, her voice a mixture of relief and wariness. "You're alive. I feared that I had perished in the fire." Queen Alara's laugh was brittle. "How convenient that would have been for you. The rightful queen dies tragically, leaving the path clear for the king's secret daughter to claim the throne." "That's not," Leora began, but Alara cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Spare me your denials. I know everything. How our father changed the succession laws in secret. How he planned to announce you as his heir during the consecration ceremonies." Her voice hardened. "How very fortunate that he fell ill before he could do so." "You poisoned him," Leora said, the accusation flat and certain. Alara's smile was cold. "Politics requires difficult decisions. Sister, father had become unreliable in his judgments, allowing a child raised in secrecy to take the throne over his publicly acknowledged daughter. It would have thrown the kingdom into chaos." "So instead you created chaos of your own," Syrian interjected, stepping forward. "A poisoned king, a palace in flames, and a false queen as bait for a legendary knight." Alara's attention shifted to him, her eyes narrowing. "The famous Knight of Ashes. You don't look like much." She glanced past them, and Syrian heard the soft sounds of guards taking positions around the ruined hall. But then, legends rarely live up to their promise in the flesh. "Why the elaborate trap?" Syrian demanded, buying time as he assessed their deteriorating situation. "Why not simply declare yourself queen after your father's illness?" "Because of that damned legend," Alara snarled, her composure cracking. "The Knight of Ashes who judges the worthy heir. The common people still believe in such nonsense, and there are those in the court who would use it against me. I needed both the knight and my sister eliminated before making my claim." "And Prince Doran?" Leora asked. "Was he part of your plan from the beginning?" A flash of something, annoyance, worry, crossed Alara's face. "My husband has been a loyal supporter of my rightful claim." "Your puppet, you mean?" Leora countered. "We found his letters, Alara. He's not content to be prince consort to a queen. He wants Al-Rasha for himself." "Enough!" Alara's voice echoed through the ruined hall. She gestured sharply, and guards stepped from the shadows, surrounding them completely. "Seize them both." The knight will face public execution as an assassin who infiltrated the palace. And as for you, sister, her smile returned, colder than before. A private end, I think. Grief has driven you to take your own life, overcome by the tragic deaths of our father and the queen. The guards advanced, weapons drawn. Syrian pushed Leora behind him, drawing his sword. He had fought against worse odds, but never with someone else to protect. Never in such confined quarters. "Wait," came a new voice, deep and commanding despite its evident weakness. From another shadowed entrance emerged a thin figure, leaning heavily on a walking staff. An elderly man with a crown sitting askew on his white hair. "Father!" Leora gasped. King Thalion of Al-Rasha looked like a ghost of his former self. His once robust frame withered, his face gaunt, but his eyes burned with the same violet fire as his daughter's, and his voice carried the weight of decades of rule. "What madness is this, Alara? Armed men in the palace? Threats against your own sister?" Alara's shock quickly gave way to calculation. "Father, you should be resting. Your illness—" "Was no illness at all, but poison," the king interrupted harshly. "Poison that has been slowly purged from my system, thanks to the efforts of a loyal servant who recognized its symptoms." He straightened slightly, seeming to draw strength from his righteous anger. "Did you think I would not recognize the taste of black root extract, daughter? The same poison used against my own father 30 years ago?" Alara's face had gone pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Lies ill become a queen," Thalion said wearily. He turned to the guards, who stood frozen in confusion. "Arrest the queen and Prince Doran for treason against the crown, and send for Lieutenant Mira of the Palace Guard. She alone remained loyal when others turned against me." The guards hesitated, looking between the king and Alara. It was a dangerous moment, the balance of power hanging by a thread. Then, from yet another entrance, strode Prince Doran, flanked by his own men. "What's this? The old king lives." His handsome face twisted with contempt. "How inconvenient." "Doran," Alara hissed, "this isn't the plan." "Plans change, my dear," Doran replied dismissively. He addressed the assembled guards. "The king is clearly unwell, his mind affected by his long illness. He should be returned to his chambers and placed under the care of my personal physician." The guards' uncertainty deepened. Some looked to Alara, others to the king, still others to Prince Doran. The tension in the ruined hall was palpable, a spark away from violence. Into this fraught silence, Syrian stepped forward, his sword still drawn, but lowered to a non-threatening position. "The legend of the Knight of Ashes," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "speaks of one who can discern the true heir from the false. I make no claim to such mystical powers." He looked around at the assembled guards, meeting their eyes one by one. "But even a simple knight can recognize honor from treachery, loyalty from ambition." He turned to King Thalion and knelt, laying his sword at the monarch's feet. "Your Majesty, I pledge my blade to your service and to the service of your rightful heir, whomever you have chosen." This simple act of fealty broke the spell of indecision. One by one, the palace guards moved to stand beside the king, leaving only Doran's personal men supporting the prince and his wife. Doran's face contorted with rage. "Seize them!" he commanded his remaining followers. "Seize them all!" What followed was chaos. Doran's men surged forward, weapons drawn. Syrian reclaimed his sword and pushed the king behind him, beside Leora. The palace guards formed a protective ring around the royal family, meeting the attack with disciplined defense. Steel rang against steel, echoing through the ruined hall. Syrian found himself facing Doran himself, the prince surprisingly skilled with a blade. They circled each other, trading blows, each seeking an opening in the other's guard. "You should have stayed a legend, knight," Doran snarled, lunging forward. Legends can't die, but men bleed easily enough. Syrian parried the thrust and countered with a sweeping slash that forced Doran back. And princes fall as readily as commoners when justice finds them. Their duel carried them across the hall, away from the main fight. Doran was younger, faster, but Syrian had experience and discipline on his side. They were evenly matched, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. Until Doran, frustrated by his inability to break through Syrian's defense, resorted to trickery. He feigned a stumble, and when Syrian hesitated, that ingrained reluctance to strike an off-balance opponent, Doran flung a handful of ash from the burnt floor into the knight's eyes. Temporarily blinded, Syrian fell back, desperately parrying by sound and instinct. Doran pressed his advantage, driving the knight toward a section of weakened flooring. "So much for the legendary Knight of Ashes," Doran mocked, preparing a killing blow. "Felled by the very element that gave you your name." But as Syrian blinked furiously to clear his vision, something strange happened. The ash that should have incapacitated him instead seemed to fall away, repelled by some unseen force. His sight cleared instantly, in time to see Doran's blade descending toward his head. Syrian moved with preternatural speed, sidestepping the blow and capturing Doran's wrist in an iron grip. With his other hand, he brought the pommel of his sword down on the prince's temple with calculated force. Doran crumpled to the floor, unconscious, but alive. Across the hall, the fighting had subsided. Alara stood surrounded by loyal palace guards, her expression a mixture of hatred and defeat. The few remaining men loyal to Doran had surrendered or fled. Syrian returned to where King Thalion stood supported by his younger daughter. The old man's strength was clearly failing, but his eyes were alert and filled with grim satisfaction. "Well fought, Knight of Ashes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It seems the legends were not entirely fanciful after all." Syrian bowed his head. "I am no legend, Your Majesty. Just a man who recognizes the difference between right and wrong." "Sometimes," the king replied with a tired smile. "That is legend enough." In the days that followed, order was gradually restored to Al-Rasha. King Thalion, though weakened by the poison, survived and resumed his rule with Leora publicly acknowledged as his heir. Alara and Prince Doran were imprisoned to await trial for treason, their allies in the court identified and removed from positions of power. The palace began the long process of rebuilding, both physically and politically. Lieutenant Mira, who had remained loyal to the king throughout the crisis, was promoted to commander of the Royal Guard, with a mandate to reform the corps from within. As for Syrian, he was offered honors, wealth, and a permanent position in the royal household. Standing in the partially restored throne room, facing the king and Princess Leora, he listened to the generous offers with polite attention. "The Knight of Ashes should have a place of honor at court," Thalion concluded. "What say you, Sir Syrian? Will you accept our gratitude and remain in Al-Rasha?" Syrian's gaze moved from the king to Leora, whose violet eyes held a question he wasn't yet ready to answer. He bowed deeply. "Your Majesty honors me beyond my worth," he said carefully. "But I fear I must decline. There are other fires in the world, other injustices that require attention. A wandering knight serves best by wandering." Disappointment flickered across Leora's face, quickly masked by a dignified nod. "The kingdom of Al-Rasha will always be open to you, Sir Knight," she said formally. "Should you ever wish to return?" Later, as Syrian prepared to depart the city, Leora found him at the stables, checking the saddle on a horse provided by the royal household. "You're really leaving, then," she said. "No longer the princess, but simply a young woman saying goodbye to a friend." "I must," Syrian replied, turning to face her. "The legend of the Knight of Ashes has been revived by what happened here. There will be others who seek to use it, and me, for their own purposes." "And is that so terrible?" Leora asked, stepping closer. "To be a symbol of justice, Syrian smiled sadly. Symbols can't live, princess. They can't make mistakes or grow weary or question their path. I'm just a man, not the legend they would make of me. Then don't be the legend, she said simply. Be the man. Here, with people who value both. For a moment, Syrian allowed himself to imagine it. A life within these walls. A purpose beyond wandering. Perhaps even... But no. The memories of Varenth were still too fresh. The lessons, too painfully learned. Perhaps someday, he said gently, when the world has fewer fires that need quenching. Leora studied his face, then nodded once, accepting his decision. From within her robes, she produced a small object, a ring bearing the royal seal of Al-Rasha. Take this, she said, pressing it into his hand. Not as a chain to bind you, but as a key to return, should you ever wish it. Syrian closed his fingers around the ring, feeling its weight, the weight of possibility, of a future not yet determined. I will keep it safe, he promised. He mounted his horse and rode through the city gates as the sun rose on a new day. Behind him lay Al-Rasha, rebuilding from ashes. Before him stretched the open road, leading to unknown challenges. And within him burned the knowledge that he had not simply played a part in an ancient legend, but had helped write a new chapter, one where truth prevailed over treachery and justice over ambition. The Knight of Ashes rode on, neither fleeing from nor chasing his name, but carrying it as he carried the princess's ring, a reminder of who he was, and perhaps who he might someday choose to become. In the palace, Princess Leora stood at the highest remaining tower, watching until the knight's figure disappeared beyond the horizon. She then turned to the tasks ahead, helping her father rule, preparing for her own eventual succession, rebuilding what had been broken. But sometimes, when ash from the reconstruction drifted through the air, catching the sunlight like tiny stars, she would think of a knight who had pulled her from flames, thinking he had saved royalty, only to discover he had been used as bait. And she would smile, knowing that sometimes traps catch more than their intended prey. Sometimes they catch legends, heroes, and perhaps, in time, something even more valuable, a future as yet unwritten, waiting for the right moment to begin.